Today we're at the Fitchville Conservation League canning venison. I'm with Gary and he's doing the first step in trimming out the venison for the canning process.
One of the keys to trimming out venison meat is you want to remove as much of the silver skin as possible. Although it is somewhat edible, it does give the meat maybe an off flavor, especially to some of those novice venison eaters. You want to have a nice sharp knife, cutting board. Try to be as sanitary as possible. And what you want to do is just take off this thin layer of silver skin by sliding your knife underneath and just removing it, putting it in your discard pile. You'll have a nice chunk of meat left over. A little bit of silver skin won't be too bad. And then you want to cube this up into approximately 1 inch or so pieces. Move on to your next piece. Again, you see this silver skin here, just get your knife underneath it there and just slide it off. Similar to how you might fillet a fish, taking its skin off. Off it goes. Quarter out your meat, about 1 inch pieces. And this will be the meat we use in our canning process. And throughout the day, we're going to show you a few different recipes, beef stew, canning regular meat, and we're also going to can some chili that we previously made. Sharp knife is key. The advantage to cubing the meat up, it will can and cook a little more evenly. If you used one big chunk of meat, it may not cook evenly through. So by cubing it up, and it also makes bite-sized pieces. Once this canning process is done, you take the meat out of the can and you could eat it right out of the can. It's fully cooked, ready to consume. Therefore, it makes a much more desirable piece of meat to eat. The part of the deer that we're using here, most of this are hind quarter roasts. There are some other trimmings throughout the deer that probably wouldn't make it to the normal dinner plate, but the canning process takes a otherwise tough cut of meat and actually tenderizes it and makes it very edible. Almost like those tasty backstraps you might eat. Now the process of chunking out the meat. If you do your own processing of your deer at home, you could take your roasts and chunk these down into larger pieces, Ziploc bag them, put them in the fridge or the freezer, and then at a later time you could thaw or take the meat out and continue this process for canning. As you're trimming the deer, you could take some of the other cuts of meat, again, quarter them out. You could do this small little chunking as you're quartering out your deer while you have all your processing equipment out. You can freeze it, Ziploc bag it for later use during the canning process. What my friend Jaron here likes to do is do a lot of this cutting up process as he's processing his deer, so that at a later time it's a lot easier to do for the canning process, such as I'm doing right now, cutting it up into smaller, approximately 1 inch pieces.
So we're cold packing our venison today, meaning that the meat is not cooked prior to putting it in the jar. I'm going to fill my pint jar with all the meat that Gary has pre-cubed. A pint jar will hold roughly 1 pound of meat, and a quart jar will hold 2 pounds of meat. Now as I'm putting it in here, I'm making sure I squeeze all the air pockets out as good as I can, and I'm going to leave roughly 1 inch of headspace. Easy way to determine that is the bottom of this ring. That's about 1 inch below the top of the jar. If you have one of these tools, you can use the steps at the bottom to measure how far the headspace is down from the top of the jar. So we're looking at right about 1 inch right there. With this method, we do not add much water to it. The meat itself will actually make its own broth through the canning process, but it's important to get all the bubbles out. So I'm just going to run my spatula around the outside to make sure all them large pockets of air are removed. Now that we have the air pockets out of the jar, I'm going to add just a tablespoon or 2 of water, and that's to fill in any little voids that we missed. I'm going to give it 3 spoons, and that should be good. We're not trying to fill it up to that 1 inch mark. But at this point, we're ready to add a half a cube of beef bouillon, as well as a half a teaspoon of canning salt. Now I use canning salt because it's pure, it doesn't have iodine in it. That iodine or extra minerals that you can get in table salt will make the water kind of cloudy once it's done canned. If you have a restrictive diet and can't eat a lot of salt, you do not need to add the beef bouillon or the canning salt. That's entirely for flavor. Now that we have the jar filled with our salt and bouillon, we're ready to add our lid and our ring. Now with the lids, you don't have to boil them like you did in the past. You just want to make sure that they are clean. And then the ring goes on finger tight. You don't want to put any wrist into it. Just use your fingers to get it firm enough to where air can still escape for the canning process. Now before putting the lids on, I'm going to wipe the rims and check for any chips. We want to make sure the rim is clean, that way we get a good seal. If there's any type of debris or a chip in the glass, we won't get a good seal and we'll have to consume that food immediately. It won't be safe to put on the shelf for an extended period of time. Now we're ready to place lids on each of our jars. These lids have been cleaned. And now the bands go on finger tight.
Yes, we want to get these potatoes into approximately a 3/4 inch cube. And this will help with the canning process and make them nice and tender. You don't have to be exact by getting out a ruler or measuring stick. Roughly chopped garlic, another ingredient to our stew process. And then the next item is going to be easy baby carrots. Generally out of the bag, they're nice and small, but we just like to quarter them up just a little bit more. Again, you make a nice little tender bite-sized pieces. To summarize the ingredients for our canned stew process, of course we have our cubed up venison, approximately 1-inch squares. We have roughly chopped onions, about 3/4 cubed potatoes, baby carrots that are approximately quartered out, crushed garlic. We have beef bouillon cubes. We're going to use approximately 1/2 of a beef bouillon cube per jar. We have some canning salts, and of course we're going to use a 1-pint wide mouth jar. You could use any jar depending on the size you want to make. These tend to work best in the processing.
Now we're ready to put our ingredients for beef stew into the jar. As Gary already prepared our ingredients here, we'll just work our way down the line. With this, I'm only going to fill the jar about half full of venison. And you can fill it as full as you want. If you want it really meaty, fill it a little bit more, but I like middle of the road. Move down and put our potatoes in next. Then we're going to put a few carrots in. A few onions on top. As I'm doing this, I'm making sure I don't exceed more than 1 inch of headspace or go less than 1 inch of headspace. I'm aiming for everything to end up about right here. Just going to give it a pinch of crushed garlic. Half a bouillon cube. And we're going to go just a few more onions, and I think I can fit a few more carrots in there. Press it all down. Now we're ready for a half teaspoon of canning salt. And we need to make some broth out of it, so we have some hot water ready to go. That'll mix with the bouillon cube nicely. We're just going to fill the jar up with hot water until the 1 inch of headspace is met. Now I'm going to run my spatula around the outside to get any air pockets out. That released some bubbles, so I can add a little bit more water now. And that one's good. Just gonna wipe the rim before putting my lid on, making sure there's no debris or chips in the jar. Have my cleaned lid ready to go on, and my ring's gonna go on finger tight, just like the other ones. Now that we have our jars filled, we're ready to put them in the pressure canners. But before we start loading them in, I have to add some water to the pressure canners. Follow the manufacturer's directions with your particular pressure canner. With these, I know there's a little line in there that gets the water level up to about here. After the water's in both pressure canners, we're ready to add some white vinegar. Now that's not necessary, but I like to give it just a quick splash. And by giving it a quick splash in here, it keeps the outside of the jar from getting impurities, white minerals from the water that's outside in the pressure canner. Okay, so we're ready to put these in. Now these pressure canners will hold 16 wide mouth pint jars, and I'm actually going to have 2 layers of jars in here. That's 8 in the bottom. Now I'm going to add another one of these and put it between the 2 layers of jars. What I didn't show you before is that both of these canners have one of these in the bottom of it. That keeps the jars from sitting directly on the bottom. If they sat on the bottom of the canner, that would put too much heat on the bottom of the jars and could potentially cause them to crack.